Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight we're going to have four people, and we're going to start out with Letitia Baldrige. Letty Baldrige died recently at the age of 86, and she was the master of manners, the doyenne of decorum. She wrote books on manners and behavior, how to act properly in social situations. She actually made the cover of Time magazine for doing that. In many ways, she was a feminist of a different sort in the 1970s when feminism was a major societal movement in America. No consciousness raising, no bra burning. She just taught women how to behave properly and how to advance in the world. And she certainly had quite a career herself. The daughter of a Republican congressman from Nebraska, she began her career in the State Department in the 50s. She worked with Clare Boothe Luce. She worked for a time for Joseph Kennedy at the Merchandise Mart here in Chicago. She was what many people say was the first female executive at Tiffany's. And in the 1970s, she worked for 2 years for the CIA, specializing in psychological warfare. All this including the cover of Time magazine and best-selling books, but she's best known for something else. With her background stressing manners, kindness, and courtesy, and the fact that she went to school with Jackie Kennedy at Vassar and Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, Jackie Kennedy tapped her to become the White House Social Secretary in 1961, so she was a part of Camelot from 1961 to 1963, and she coordinated all the social functions at the White House. She got in trouble there a couple of times. She introduced liquor into social functions at the White House where it hadn't been before. When President and Mrs. Kennedy went to India, she arranged for them to give leather-bound gifts to their hosts, which was not exactly the right social thing to do in a Hindu country. And John Kennedy called her Miss Push and Pull because she was always making him conform to social decorum at the White House parties. But in total, she was an amazing host, and she helped Mrs. Kennedy out remarkably. In fact, she resigned from her position in early 1963 when she got married, and she signed on again after John Kennedy's assassination, primarily to help Jackie Kennedy with the funeral arrangements and her life after John Kennedy was killed. She became a consultant to Lady Bird Johnson, Pat Nixon, and Nancy Reagan. But again, her most famous role was Jackie Kennedy's confidant in the White House. Here's a show hosted by Tom Brokaw where he talks about Jackie Kennedy in the White House, and Letitia Baldrige is quoted.
When her husband was elected president, she became the most stylish first lady of the century. Leticia Baldrige was her social secretary.
Now somebody young had come into the White House with a young, beautiful wife and two young children, and it just seemed to make a renaissance in this country. And Mrs. Kennedy turned the White House into a museum of great American furniture. And the furnishings suddenly became beautiful, and the house became beautiful.
Women everywhere tried to imitate the Jackie look.
The way she put her hair curlers in her hair, what kind of food she fed her babies, whatever it was, they just wanted to imitate her all the way.
Mrs. Kennedy brought a new sense of glamour to the White House and to the image of the American presidency. When Carolyn and John arrived on Pennsylvania Avenue with their pets, toys, and playmates, they were the youngest residents of the White House in years.
The White House was not staid and formal and official in those days. It was always warm and welcoming and filled with the sounds of children.
Letty Baldrige could take credit for a lot of that, and she was no political naive. Here she talks about how John Kennedy addressed a press conference.
Mr. President, it's been a long time since we've had a definitive report on your health from the best possible source. How is your aching back?
It depends on the weather, political and otherwise.
At a press conference, he'd get a very nasty question, and he would point at the reporter and he'd say, "George, I can't believe you asked me that," and then point a finger at the next journalist, and everybody would be breaking up laughing. The question never got answered.
Well, of course, we talked to a certain extent how Camelot was an artificial creation. There was a bit of myth-making about the Kennedys, but Letitia Baldrige was genuine. Her concerns about manners, decorum, and proper social etiquette are something we miss today. And she summed it all up very simply when she was asked the difference between then and now.
There was definitely more innocence.
Jackie Kennedy has become the standard by which all other first ladies are measured. Letitia Baldrige had no small part in that. I have to give you this one quote by Letitia Baldrige. She said, "When Barbra Streisand wears nightgowns for her fourth wedding and puts her bosoms in people's faces, everybody thinks that's the way to behave. Jacqueline Kennedy, by contrast, did not know a moment of bad taste." That pretty much tells you what you need to know. It's no cliche to say Letitia Baldrige is one of those people whose like we won't see again. We're going to move on now to Jim Durham, who died recently at the age of 65. Jim Durham was the best best basketball announcer I ever heard. Think about basketball announcing, and in some ways it's much harder than either baseball or football because of the constant action, and it also requires an intimate knowledge of the game. And Jim Durham was great at announcing, and he had the intimate knowledge of the game. Here's an ESPN report on Jim Durham.
Hall of Fame sportscaster Jim Durham died this weekend while at home outside of Houston. Jim was known to many of us and so many of you as the voice of NBA on ESPN Radio since its inception in January of 1996. His last assignment was just last Tuesday, the opener between the Heat and Celtics, and he sat alongside his longtime partner, Dr. Jack Ramsay. Prior to ESPN, Jim worked for NBC, CBS, and Turner Sports. He was a commentator for the Bulls, the White Sox, and Mavericks as well. In 2011, Jim was honored by the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame with the Kurt Gowdy Media Award. Michael Jordan just texted, "The voice of champions, I will miss him." Jim Durham was 65 years old. He is survived by his wife, his 3 children, and several grandchildren.
Well, Jim Durham announced a lot of basketball, but I knew him here in Chicago when he was the announcer for the Michael Jordan era, hence the tribute from Michael Jordan there. During the time the Bulls won their 6 championships, Durham made some of the most famous calls in basketball history. And here are a couple of them, including the great shot over Craig Elo to beat the Cavaliers in the playoffs, and the shot that won the NBA championship against the Utah Jazz, where Jordan pushed off Brian Russell to free for the shot. Of course, you won't hear Durham say that.
The inbounds pass comes into Jordan. Here's Michael at the foul line. A shot on Elo. Good! The Bulls win! They win it! Set the Cleveland Cavaliers. Michael Jordan hits it at the foul line. Win or lose, game 6 for the Bulls. Jordan, 20-footer, head of the key. Good! Chicago is world champions once more. 20,273 in stunned silence here in the Coliseum. The Chicago Bulls have won their 6th NBA championship.
Jim Durham is one of those sports announcers that if you grew up with him or you listened to him as an adult, you'll remember him for the rest of your life. We're going to move on now to Elliott Carter, who died recently at the age of 103. Elliott Carter was the Dean of American Classical Music in the 20th century. Caveat here, I'm not crazy about his music, but he won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and he's a recognized giant in the field. Here's a little bit from Jay Nordlinger on Elliott Carter. Elliott Carter, one of the leading composers in the world, has died. He was 103. When Carter was born in 1908, Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House. Carter was fully 8 years old when America entered World War I. He remembered this distinctly. At least one of Carter's grandfathers was in the Civil War, fought at Gettysburg. In fact, Carter knew him well. Grandpa was a jolly old man who had lots of fun and was very shrewd. When Carter was a boy, he lived on 114th Street at Riverside Drive here in New York City. On the roof of their building, they played with early radios trying to catch a signal. It was hearing a fairly new piece at Carnegie Hall that decided him on becoming a composer. That was Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Stravinsky was quite a young man when he wrote it, barely 30. I could go on. I have my reservations about Carter's music and philosophy, to put it mildly, but I'm not so sure I ever talked with a more richly experienced man. Smart son of a gun, too. I'm going to include a little bit from some interviews with Elliott Carter, but before I do, I want to play a little of his music, preceded by the Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, so you can see where he got his influence to do his sort of atonal classical music of the 20th century. Here is a little bit of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. That was the groundbreaking stuff that Elliott Carter listened to coming out of Carnegie Hall in the early 20th century. And here is a little bit from his clarinet concerto from 1996, and you can hear the influence that Stravinsky had on it. Like I said, not my kind of music, but hey, the guy did win 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Another one of Elliott Carter's early influences was Nadia Boulanger. Nadia Boulanger was the famous French teacher and composer who also guided Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, and Virgil Thompson. Here he talks a little bit about studying under Nadia Boulanger in Paris.
Roy Orbison suggested that I study with Nadia Boulanger, and since I spoke French, it was an easy thing to do. She insisted on going back to the very beginning, and we had to do harmony exercises, and she was very fussy. And she would do things that no harmony teacher had ever done, that, as far as I know, before, to me at least, that she would show how if the voice just changed a little bit and went up instead of went down, it made a much more musical effect. What it is this intense focus on the music itself and on the notes. They must mean something and be important. Of course, the most wonderful thing was that every Wednesday afternoon we sang, and the students got together, and Nadia would get a little group of instrumentalists, and we'd sing a Bach cantata, or two or three sometimes, depending on how long they were. So we must have gone through 100 Bach cantatas, maybe more by the time all the time I was there, the 3 years that I was there, which was just wonderful. Nadia felt that the music of Schoenberg and Adler, those early music that had been written before the First World War and shortly after, were all a thing of the past. This is old-fashioned. And what the new things were, things like Poulenc and Auric and other people, which she thought were very good. Well, it was hard to, for me, that was a little bit hard to take because I didn't really think. But then I finally began to be convinced that there was something interesting in this music. And so I wrote for a certain period, sort of Americanizing music, a symphony, then a piano sonata. And I was already beginning to feel that, I like that. I came to like that older dissonant music, so to speak, better than I like this. And I began to feel I'll go back and do what I was really interested in from the beginning. And that's what started this disaster that's gone on ever since.
Here's Elliott Carter talking about his musical philosophy in 2 interviews, and you can see why Jay Nordlinger thinks he's a brilliant man.
I still think that contemporary music has a certain element of interest that older music never has. It's more vivid. It's more like the way we live and the way we experience things. I mean, after all, the old days, you had all those soldiers marching and horses trotting around, and that's all in the music. Now you have these airplanes and God knows what. The whole life is so utterly different, and it seems to me that older music, which is beautiful like an old castle or something, but it doesn't have the kind of thing that the good contemporary music has.
Here he talks about his evolution from his days at Harvard when he was a young man to his philosophy before he died.
When I went to Harvard, I wanted to study music. And I went and took the first course in harmony. But I didn't know anything about that. The people who are studying in music are taking that kind of a course are all organists who are working for churches. So I wrote a very dissonant little thing for the first harmony exercise. Everybody laughed so much I decided to take up English literature. It was a scandal, and I didn't think it was a scandal. I was writing what I thought I liked to write. Because I see my music as being written for performers to perform. And we try to stimulate them in such a way that will work up their imagination and their pleasure and their interest and their skill and their desire to communicate with the audience.
Could you imagine a day when people, concert goers, would hear your music and walk out humming your music? Would you want it?
It'd be hard on their throats.
What would you want the listener to walk away with after hearing your music?
Happiness. Pleasure. I think that one of the fundamental things always is music should not only give pleasure, but it should widen one's horizon and give new kinds of fantasies and new kinds of pleasures and new kinds of surprises. and new kinds of connections between things.
Well, I didn't like that type of music, but you can't ask for more than that from a musical philosophy, and you have to give him credit. Elliott Carter, who died at 103. We're going to close tonight with someone whose music I did like more, Bill Dees. Bill Dees died recently at the age of 73, and he was a running partner of the great Roy Orbison. Now, I'm going to put it to you simply here. Roy Orbison was the greatest voice ever in rock and roll music. You can take anybody you want, and Roy Orbison was better. Here's how good he was. Elvis once said, "The one guy I don't want to follow in a concert is Roy Orbison." And Bill Dees wrote two of Roy Orbison's greatest hits. In 1964, the British invasion was going full tilt. The Beatles dominated the charts. They had just come off their first wave of singles, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," "She Loves You," "P.S. I Love You." They were ready with their second wave of singles, "From a Hard Day's Night." And in between that, Bill Dees wrote a song with Roy Orbison, and it shot to #1. It became as big as anything the Beatles did that year, and it became an iconic song in rock and roll in the 1960s. "Oh, Pretty Woman."
Pretty woman, walking down the street, pretty woman, the kind I like to meet, pretty woman. I don't believe you, you're not the truth. No one could look as good as you. Mercy.
Here's Bill Dees in an NPR interview with the story behind Pretty Woman.
The night we wrote Pretty Woman, he said, "You don't have to go to work Monday if you don't want to." Because I was arguing over a dime raise. It was time for them to raise me a dime. He said, "Buy yourself an electric piano, and I'll take you on the road with me." And he said, "I'll pay you what the band's getting." The first hit song that Roy Orbison had was the Everly Brothers recording Claudette, which was about his wife. And they had been separated and divorced, actually, and they'd gotten back together. And when they got back together, he was just a changed person. And she came bopping down the stairs and said, "Give me some money." "And what do you need money for?" he said. And she said, "Well, I gotta go to the store." And as she walked away, they were like whispering and kissing bye, away from me. And I stood up at the table, and he came back to the table, and I said, "Does this sound funny?" "Oh, pretty woman, don't need no money." And he laughed, and he sat down, and he said, "There's nothing funny about Pretty Woman." And he right away started "Pretty woman walking down the street." Well, by the time she got back, we had it written. He turned to me with the guitar lick. He said, I feel like I need to say something while they're playing, dun, 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 And I said, "Well, you're always saying mercy. Why don't you say mercy?" And, I said, "Every time you see a pretty girl, you say mercy."
Mercy.
Toured the world, almost. I went to England twice and across Europe once with him. I was shocked when we got off the plane in London, and there was like 10,000 people there at the airport meeting the plane. And I'd just been playing cards with the guy, and I stepped off that plane, and I thought, "Oh my, look at this." It was like the Beatles when they came over here.
Naturally, like all good things, Bill Dees got involved in a lawsuit over the appropriation of "Oh, Pretty Woman" by Two Live Crew in the 1990s, got settled out of court eventually. Face it, everybody wanted a piece of "Oh, Pretty Woman." I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Taps. And as a final tribute to Bill Dees, I'm going to play part of the other song that he wrote for Roy Orbison. In some ways, I think it's an even better song because it shows off Roy Orbison's voice even better. It's called "It's Over," and it went to #1 also. It wasn't as big a hit as Pretty Woman, but it's a great song.
Your baby doesn't love you anymore.